To be perfectly honest with you, I don't know how many years I've been able to see the creatures that live in the woods. It is just as far as long as I can remember. It certainly started when I was just a child. I was never frightened by them, likely because they never appeared threatening. Not to me anyway. I think to start with, I thought they were fairies. You see, they were very small, and I was only a young petite girl, but some of them seemed not much bigger than my dolls. They never let me fully see them, just snatched glimpses here and there. I loved to play with them. I called it playing, anyway. Imagined it was a game of hide and seek. I wasn't as though they'd actively participate. I liked to pretend that they enjoyed it too. They never showed me any malicious intent, yet, even as a very young child, I seemed to instinctively know that I was not to talk about them, that I must never tell anyone of their existence. And I didn't. I honestly never felt the need to tell somebody. But those were simpler times, and as an only child, I would often spend hours in the woods, as they were just behind the houses, close enough for me to hear my mother call me back for food. I had a good life. I often heard the word lucky being thrown around. We were lucky. Dad had that bonus and had bought us a VCR. We were lucky that our aunt had left my mother some money, and we went abroad on holiday. And I had my fairy friends. All would be fine, so long as I never told anybody. Whether I put two and two together and chose to ignore it, whether I honestly had no idea, I still didn't mention them to anybody that when some of the local pets went missing. Within the space of a few months, 2 cats and 1 small dog, belonging to an older lady at the end of the street, disappeared and were later on found in the woods. When I say found, I mean parts were found. The majority of each animal had been eaten, covered in bite and tear marks. The locals thought it to be a fox. That was the only likely suspect. We don't have wolves, bears, cougars, etc. The worst that can then happen is you catch a chill, as the woods are always so cold and damp. But a fox can and will kill small pets. Just for fun sometimes. People were more vigilant, just about keeping pets inside. And for a while, things seemed okay. And then the bad luck started up again. They called it bad luck because it was little things that couldn't really be blamed on anything else. But there was still a particular tiresome issue. Flat tires, missing food, gardens destroyed. There was a spate of little occurrences over the next few weeks, and I could remember my mother standing on the doorstep, cup of tea in one hand, cigarette in the other, although she's given up years ago. She was chatting to the neighbor, who had huge bags under her eyes, about a noise that was waking her up every morning at 5 a.m. that she just couldn't get to the bottom of. That day, when I went into the woods, the little people didn't want to play. And that was when I started to get suspicious. So, I did something that an 8-year-old who was missing her friends seemed perfectly reasonable. Although now looking back as an adult, racks me with guilt. I took them an offering. Miss Stone had an old grumpy tabby cat who hated everybody. It was little more than a bag of bones with fur, as it was so old, and when it wasn't sleeping, it would just hiss at you when you walked by. When it was younger, and I was really small, it terrified me. So when I saw it sleeping on the doorstep, somehow, having snuck out of the house, I took my chance. It barely weighed anything, and couldn't even be bothered to scratch me. Just hissed a few times as I ran with it into the woods. I heard them as soon as I got to our spot. I had stood holding the cat, and I heard the trees rustle. I knew they were there. They were watching me. I'm not exactly proud of what I did next. I threw the cat into the bushes and ran. Ran as fast as I could, into my house, up into my bedroom. A couple of days later, I heard my mom consoling our neighbor, saying it was likely the cat had wandered off to die, as they were apt to do. My neighbor was very attached to that cat, but she did receive some good news, that her son and daughter-in-law were expecting a baby after a year of trying. I stopped going into the woods as I got older. Teenage life does take over. Then, I went to college and moved away. But I still often hear about my mother talk about how you have to be careful if you walk through the woods using the shortcut to the shops. That there are often dead rabbits and squirrels around. Funny that in all those years, they'd never actually seen what Fox was responsible for, though. I am a teacher in a primary school in the UK right now. Every year, we take a group of 11-year-olds to an outdoor recreation center, teaching them lifelong survival skills and team building. It's a lot of fun, and both the students and staff have a blast. As staff, we are always trying to find new activities to try out with the kids, testing their skills and mindsets. It isn't always meant to be easy, sometimes doing something out of their comfort zone, but in a controlled environment is imperative in overcoming fear, which was how I found myself checking out some caves a few miles away, just from the residential center, and seeing if they would be safe enough and appropriate to use when we took the next lot of our kids up there in just a couple months. Now, of course, these were 11-year-olds. Most of them will have never even seen a cave, let alone have gone spelunking. So we were not expecting them to suddenly become experts, but being taken into the cold and dark with the correct safety equipment and a trusted adult can allay any fears. I was all tooled up, resplendent with a hard hat and light attached and hiking boots. I hadn't planned to go too far, as in, although I had done this several times, one fall and you could be stranded. This was purely a reconnaissance expedition. Sometimes, though, we got caught up in things and don't realize how far we've gone or how long it has been. Time seemed to fly by, and there and before I knew it, I was pretty deep into a cavern of tunnels, and quite away from the mouth of the cave. Of course, that would be the exact time the batteries in the hard hat started to flicker, indicating I needed to change them. Thank God I'd had the foresight to pack some more. It did mean that I was plunged into total darkness for a few seconds, whilst I removed one set and replaced them as quickly as I could. And in just those few seconds, I heard a noise. Now, as well as being a teacher and keen explorer, I'm also an avid reader. And yes, horror is one of my favorite genres. So, upon hearing that noise, I can honestly say that the thoughts of Tommy knockers and cave-dwelling demons came to my mind pretty quickly. It was sort of a high-pitched screech. Now, here in the UK, we don't have bears, or indeed any kind of man-eating animals that live in our cave systems. Bats, of course, but I hadn't heard of any flapping or felt the rush of wind from wings. So, I didn't think this was being made by them. Following all the classic foibles, I dropped the second battery, and now had to scrape about in the dark to find it. The screech then turned into a growl, and I knew then for sure that I was not alone. Still grabbing around the floor, I could hear movement, and I damn near crapped myself. Finally, I got the battery and managed to slot it in and turn the torch back on. I pushed my back up against the cave wall as far as I could, somehow imagining that it might protect me from whatever was here with me and making that noise. I knew I had to look before I made a run for it. I had to know what it was. So I turned and looked. I can honestly say two things. The first, I have never been more terrified in my entire life. And two, I have absolutely no idea what it was that I saw. Have you ever seen the film The Descent? Well, there are some cave-dwelling creatures in that which are the only thing I can think of akin to what I saw. Lighting and shadow play a huge part in distorting size and features, and the fact that I was beyond petrified means that even my memories are now not 100% reliable. But the thing in front of me appeared to be of average human height. It was that same awful pallid albino color, same as the creatures in the film, appearing entirely hairless. I couldn't make out any eyes or even where the eyes should be on its misshapen head. Only some sort of holes for a nose, and I presume mouth. It was on 2 feet, and appeared humanoid enough, like it had limbs like a person. Only the torso was deformed and twisted. And then it made that screech again, and I was able to pull myself out of my frozen in terror cliché and run as fast as I possibly could, back to the mouth of the cave and out of there. I only stopped running when I had reached my car, and even then, it was key in the ignition and go. I can't even recall when I stopped shaking. After I had climbed down, the more practical side of my brain took over, and I began hunting for a reasonable explanation for what it is that I saw. The air is thinner down there, and I had been in the darkness save for the torchlight for hours. After the mishap with the batteries, it was far more likely that I suffered some form of hallucination. Lack of oxygen maybe. Lights playing tricks on my eyes. That must have been the cause. Just to be sure though, I reported back to the school that the caves were dangerous. Too many potholes and chances of kids tripping and hurting. That was enough to knock it off the agenda, so we never took the kids there, and I have never been back. I mean, I'm 99% sure it was an overactive horror fan's imagination, coupled with extenuating circumstances. But what if it wasn't? What if I really did see and hear that thing down there? I'm convinced I was, even though I try and force myself not to believe it. I thought I would send my story into you, and you can tell me what you make of it. I was around 12 or 13, the night we were driving through a storm, and I saw this thing standing by the side of the road. I was in the back of the car with my 2 younger siblings, who at the time were both fast asleep. My mother was driving, knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel so hard and on the verge of giving herself a migraine, just from concentrating too much. The rain was lashing down the windscreen, and it must have been awful, just trying to keep from falling over. My dad at the time was riding shotgun, desperately trying to read the map, face screwed up in concentration as he turning it around and trying to see any tiny markings with the only smallest amount of light. You were either lost or close to it, and they were trying to make as much time as they could, driving through the Pine Barrens, so we can try and find a B or a motel to stay in, until the storm passed the next day. The thunder and lightning continued and decided to join the driving rain and high gust of wind. My poor mother jumped every time there's a clap, her speed sometimes reducing to almost a crawl. She was very aware that her 3 children were in the back of the car, and she would do nothing to place us in danger. After another flash of lightning, I looked out my window on the passenger side, sitting behind my father. Since we were cruising along at the pace of a person for a leisurely jog, I got a good glimpse of him, the creature on the road. 2 strikes of lightning, one after the other, illuminated the sky in the area, just enough for me to be able to make out his features. He was tall, stood on 2 legs, just like a person, and as tall as a person, like my dad would be. He looked like he was gray, not wearing gray, as he wasn't wearing clothes. Like his whole skin was gray. He had long skinny arms that were just dangling by his side. His head looked like a mixture, or maybe a horse and goat. I know that sounds weird, but believe me, everything about this thing was weird. And just to top it all off, I remember him having huge bat wings that again looked like they were covered in gray skin. Unbelievably, nobody else saw it. Okay, so Mom was on the driver's side and mad concentrating on the road and not killing us. But Dad, even though he had his nose stuck in the map, I couldn't believe he hadn't noticed this thing, that his eyes hadn't been drawn to the road when the lightning struck. But it was just me. Looking back, I wish I would have shouted, even if I had been told off for waking up my brothers and sisters. At least I would have had some sort of evidence, validation. But to be honest, I was too shocked and scared to even be able to speak. I turned around so I could see out of the back when there was another bolt of lightning. But the next strike wasn't as big and didn't light up the road as much. I couldn't see him. We weren't from that area, and until I did some research after we got home, I hadn't even heard of the term cryptid. But now, it would seem that I had a rare sighting of what I know to be the Jersey Devil. It is real. This one thing happened to me a few years ago, and I will never forget, and have never been able to explain. I'm writing into you, as I wonder if one of your listeners might be able to tell me something more about it, or if they have ever had a similar experience. I was driving someone from the gym, which I joined in town, and it was fairly dark, but not pitch black. I live a little bit out of the main town, out towards the countryside. At some point in the journey, I noticed that there was a dog on the side of the road, just ahead of me. A very big dog. I was mindful of it, as the last thing that I wanted was for it to run out, and also a little surprised that I couldn't see any owner anywhere. As I got closer to it, I could see just how large it was. More like the size of a small horse, but it was shaped definitely like a dog. Very wolf-like. It was also very dark in fur. Black, I would say, but it was really hard to make out. Mostly just the outline in the absence of any real lighting. As I drove past, I remember thinking, I wouldn't want to take that thing for a walk. It stared right at me as I drove past, and I swear, although it sounds impossible, that it had glowing red eyes. But nothing has red eyes, right? I felt very uncomfortable, although I couldn't place why, and despite wanting to be careful to not run into this beast, I guess. Yes. Now, I thought of it as a beast due to the size. I also put my foot down on the accelerator to get out of there ASAP. And it ran. This thing ran alongside my car. I sped up to about 50 miles an hour. And that dog, it stayed with me. Not looking at the road, looking right into my car. Right at me with those huge eyes. I sped up faster to 70, starting to feel out of control on that windy road, but needing to lose this animal. That was what it now felt like. There was no way this thing was something from our world. I was convinced. Finally, letting out a horrendous howl, like something you'd see in a werewolf movie, it jumped off into the woods and vanished. I didn't let my speed up for more than a few seconds or miles until I was sure it was no longer beside me. I was still going too fast, but a speeding ticket was the least of my concerns right then. Thankfully, I made it home in one piece. The only thing I could think of was the Hound of the Baskervilles. You know, the old Sherlock Holmes story. I don't know what that thing was, but I can tell you with certainty, it wasn't a normal dog. It looked more like something sent straight from hell. Can you help me? I live in the Norfolk in the UK. Thanks. My wife and I had been fighting much more often. We both came home at the same time one Friday, looked at each other, just as soon as we felt the bickering washing up to the surface. And that's when we knew. We had to get out. Whatever it took. No matter how much work wouldn't get done over the weekend. We needed to get away from the hustle and bustle, and spend some time being around each other, in a way that didn't compel us to fight. I had been working just hard enough, just long enough to own a little getaway cabin, about 2 hours away. It wasn't as remote as I would have preferred, but it would do the job. We arrived and settled in with grace of a plane crash. There was no romantic carrying her over the threshold. We looked like two cats finding a place to curl up after crossing a warehouse full of rocking chairs. My wife hit the bed after we downed our Chinese food, and she was out pretty quick. We would catch up with each other in the morning, I suppose. I turned on the TV, making sure that my wife's slumber would not be disturbed. I think she could have slept through a helicopter landing at that point. I was just starting to feel my eyelids growing heavy when the sound of my wife's voice made me jump. She was calling to me. I snapped my head to her, but she was unconscious. Had she called me out in her sleep? No, it sounded too far away. But it couldn't have been anybody else's voice. She called me by my name. Then I heard her call me again. Her voice was drifting in from the open screen window to the outside. She urged me to come outside to help her carry something. The only rational explanation was that either my wife had a twin who was standing outside, or that the woman in the bed that I sat on was an imposter. She was the same person that had been with me all day, so I sided with her. I felt my forehead for any hint that I might be getting a fever, and thus prone to any auditory hallucinations. But no, I felt fine. If it really was just some prankster or joker, then there wouldn't be any need to do anything. They'd get bored and move on. Well, they didn't. The voice of my wife grew more urgent, but still stayed as low, as if they were also making an effort to not awaken my real wife. When this glimmer of insight flashed into my brain, I decided to do just that. I gently nudged my wife and urged her to wake up. I almost thought that I wasn't going to be able to, but she gradually stirred, and I spoke to her to bring her up out of wherever she was. She wasn't happy to be bothered. I told her that somebody was outside, and they were calling to me by name, and they sounded just like her. In that moment, her eyes started to open. I heard a peculiar sound come from the window, the sound of compressed air escaping. I must have attributed it to our vehicle at first, because looking back, it sounded like some kind of hiss of frustration. Whoever, whatever was out there, must not have considered me to be very bright, and seemed dismayed that I didn't rush headlong into their situation. I walked as quietly as I could across the floor and made sure the door was locked, just in case our visitor was up for more than just mild monkey shines. The door held fast, and I let go a little tension from my shoulders. When I turned around, my wife was looking at me, wide awake. She could tell that I was serious. Then, both of us were jolted at the same time, because a different voice came from down the hallway. It was the voice of our daughter. She was calling for us, the way any child calls after they've woken up after a bad dream. My wife, I'll never forget, put her hands to her face and let out a yelp before she could control herself. Me, I felt anger in an instant, but not without a measure of fear. There, my pulse became audible, and I followed the direction of the voice to the other bedroom. I jumped a second time when our daughter's voice spoke again. That's when I could see that the window in that bedroom was also open. I shut it, and that's when I heard a terrible commotion coming from where I had left my wife. She was yelling, one short step away from hysterics, judging by her tone. And there was the sound of the front door being pounded on and the doorknob rattling. I came running, as if I would suddenly find that the front door was unlocked. No, it held fast, despite the fury of the stranger on the other side. My wife was very unnerved at this point. I couldn't tell if I was mad or afraid. We hunkered down until morning, and somehow I managed to fall asleep, even though I didn't think we'd be able to. We were both overcome with so much fear. When it was fully daylight, I stepped outside to see if our visitor had done any vandalism while we were locked in a standoff. Our car and everything was left alone. We did find some unusual footprints around the property, and the places that I know for sure the stranger had stood, especially under the other bedroom window. There weren't the footprints of anyone wearing shoes or boots, though. The weather had been dry, so the prints, sadly, weren't starkly cast in mud. But the prints we could find seemed to have 3 or 4 large toes. They looked very much like animal prints, which raised more questions than answers. Also, this detail is very disturbing. The prints we could make out appeared to be bipedal and not quadrupedal, meaning this thing was walking on 2 legs. The real problem was how they knew what our daughter sounded like. Bless her soul, she hasn't been with us for 4 years. She was killed by a drunk driver. Whoever this was that paid us a visit that night must have not known that something happened to her. Honestly, I don't know if this is some freak hallucination trip. Maybe my wife had slipped me some LSD. Or maybe we had some sort of supernatural traumatic experience. I'll let you decide for me. After way too many years of living in apartments, I could finally afford to buy a house. The house really wasn't much bigger than an apartment, but the difference is apparent to anyone that's been doing this as long as I have. One day, I would own it, and that day was going to be sooner than later, because I had saved plenty for the down payment. Most stories like this tell about something strange, like a strange phenomena during the night on the first night. I didn't have that kind of trouble. It was a peaceful place, and I loved it. In fact, I slept soundly, knowing that one day it would be entirely mine in less than a decade. I got to know the places intimately, as a child begins to know the layout of their own body. I didn't discover anything unusual, except for what appeared to be the entrance to a crawl space underneath the house. The location was most peculiar. It was in the bedroom wall by the baseboards. Rather than crawling underneath the house like a proper crawl space, it seemed to go between the walls. It was very strange, and I had no idea why it was even necessary, although it was an older house. There was a lid, heavy enough to have been a component of a wood stove sealing the crawl space. It was held in place with 4 large screws. Getting those screws to turn, though, was murder. It was like they had been either over-torqued, or they had rusted in place years ago. But I got them off, and I shone a flashlight around the entrance to the crawl space. Nothing out of the ordinary. You know, like no skulls or bodies or anything like that. So I screwed everything back into place and paid it no more mind. The night after opening the crawl space was a strange one. I was about to drift off to sleep when I heard a very light sound that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was the slightest, most distant scraping sound. I woke up when it was followed by the sound of something hitting the wood floor. I was tired, and it was easy to write off as something I either dreamed of or something inconsequential. But I heard both sounds a second time when I tried to drift off. I turned on the light and looked around, unsure of what it was or what I was even looking for. I was always light on possessions. I didn't have anything to fall from anywhere. As I lay down, I heard the sounds return. It hit me. I got up and turned on the light. I took a look at the crawl space. 2 of the 4 screws had been removed and laid on the floor, while a third one was sticking out, as if it were in the middle of being unscrewed. This began a game I had to play every night. The screws would unscrew themselves, and I would put them back in. This became a source of anxiety. I wasn't sure what would be happening if all 4 screws came undone. Suppose I were to sleep through such a thing. What would I be confronted with? No matter how I tightened or glued, I was still alerted to the mild grinding of the screws turning and then the thunk of them hitting the floor. This ate away at my nerves more than I care to admit. Not until I took the extra step of welding the screws in place, knowing full well that this would deny me any use of the crawl space. Did I get any peace, though? No. The first night after my new measure, I heard a bizarre sound coming from behind the place. Suppose you had the sound of someone crying, but it was done in whispers. There was a light tapping and scratching, even after the strange sobs, and then the noise seemed to disappear. The anxiety from that experience has never left. There's a part of me that still listens for the screws turning when I'm drifting off to sleep. There was really no slow build-up to what happened to me. I was taking the garbage out into the narrow alleyway behind my place of work. Something about 2 heads shorter than me was rummaging around in our dumpster. The sound of the back door opening got its attention right away, and it fixed me with a face that seemed to borrow elements from both the insect kingdom and the reptile kingdom. The eyes were reptilian, but the overall structure of the body seemed to be as well. The shoulders were badly hunched. The frame reminded me of an armadillo trying to walk on its hind legs. The head was a few sizes too small, looking like a basketball with huge slitted eyes. The mouth reminded me of something you'd see on a praying mantis. It was when I saw that mouth that I couldn't help shouting in alarm. Again, just like a mantis, it was grinding away at whatever that it had found deemed edible. It might have been easier to stomach if I hadn't been wearing clothes. The clothing, however ragged, suggested that it wasn't just a dumb exotic animal. It was intelligent and incredibly hideous. It caught me off guard, and deep down, my instincts sent me into fight or flight. I must have had a similar effect on it, because it dropped whatever it was eating from its nubby clawed fingers and let out this terrible scream, something that reminded me of a cicada when you get too close to them. It appeared to waddle backwards. The slits of its eyes, I'll never forget. They appear to be darting about. Here's where it gets really bizarre. It stuck its hand out and appeared to do some sort of bizarre gesture. There was nothing for me to cease doing. I was counting its fingers as it was weirdly moving its hand about. I then felt something hit me, all over the entire surface of my body, like a shockwave or a blast of heat from an oven. My vision was blurred and swam, and then literally every last object in my field of vision sprouted faces and screamed until I thought my skull would shatter. I curled up into a ball on the pavement, which was now swimming with screaming faces. After what felt like hours, I stood up, but it had only been maybe 2-3 minutes. Aside from questioning what sort of living thing I had just encountered, I also wondered, had I just been on the receiving end of some sort of occult magic spell or hex? Or perhaps some sort of pheromone or chemical attack, like a beetle that sprays liquid at a predator. Did that thing, whatever it was, use some sort of defense mechanism to incapacitate me? I searched my persons to find that no chemicals or other strange substances had been left anywhere on me or around me, which then guided me to the conclusion that it had used some level of sorcery or some sort of pheromone. As you probably know, this isn't really a story I can share freely, since our location is notorious for psychedelic drug use. I'm one of the few people that have never tried any of this stuff. Whatever I saw was real. Whatever it did to me was real. It's not like I jumped at my own shadow. Just in case you decide to broadcast my story, I'm going to go on the record and say that I think I'd come across something from one of the lowest castes in reptilian society. Even though it was foraging maybe, it still had a talent for deception and illusion, which does line up with most of what I've read about reptilians. They aren't just out there. They're living everywhere without us knowing. We never even see them. Anyway, that's my story. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm a retired park ranger, and I'm one of those rangers that they almost wouldn't let me retire because I was that good at everything I did on the job. I know every ranger says that probably, and I don't mean to boast, but I've actually got papers and articles to back it up. If anyone vanished or disappeared on my watch, I'm the one that found them at the time. Or at the very least, it was my advice that led to them being discovered. I had a pretty solid career behind me, so nothing really shakes me up. Well, I got shaken up. Like all the heroes you see in a movie, I retired somewhere in the country, got a lot of animals. In my case, I settled for just a few chickens. You can't go wrong with fresh eggs. I got to know my animals just about as well as any cat or dog I could have owned. The first surprise was when I came outside one morning to check on my hens and saw the coop was a mess of blood and feathers. Now, chickens can be unpredictable in their own way. One minute they're okay and chill, and the next minute, they're turning on one of their own. Kind of like people around election season. But taking a closer look, I noticed that none of the surviving birds had any sign that they had taken part in the grisly deed. The coop that I had constructed is solid. Once the gate is shut, there's no way in or out, unless some animal was an absolute acrobat that could climb to the very top of 3 concrete walls, drop down, that was shaped like a chimney. Actually, the coop had been a chimney at one point in time. The old house on the property burned down, and the stone chimney was all that was left. But I had the inside of the chimney blocked off too, so nothing except for a very determined Santa Claus would have been able to climb up, jump down, and unseal the fence wiring that plugged the opening. I had just decided that the hens had been especially sneaky and vicious, and that they would get away with murder this time. Less than 2 days later, the same thing happened. 2 more hens bit the dust. Like I said, I don't have a very big congregation of chickens. This was beginning to eat into my daily egg production. The ground was still a little wet, so I did an inspection on the outside of my improvised chicken coop. I found something that didn't quite make sense. I did find footprints. Here's the thing. They were not animal. They were human. They were also small like a child's. Okay, so there's a mischievous kid on the run. But why would he be out in his bare feet, so early in the morning in the middle of nowhere, where there's just my home? The second surprise came when I saw that the footprints were also found on the side of the chimney, all the way to the top. The footprints that were on the ground were also on the side of the chimney, meaning that the child had not shimmied his way up the chimney or grappled up the side. It was as if he had walked like Spider-Man. I started to feel a pit in my stomach that I couldn't place. It took me a minute, but I found the trail of tracks leading off my property. I was going to track them right back to where they came from, but they disappeared. So I backtracked and found the trail of tracks where they originated. I followed my visitor's excursion backwards. This is the part where I can tell you only what I saw, not what I think, because there are some things that I avoid thinking about. The tracks led me down a lone road, and the further along I got, the thicker the timber became on both sides. And at one point, the trail eventually led off into the woods, to a thick area of brush that I couldn't get to, which means a small child would have no chance. I was clueless and terrified. What exactly I had been dealing with, I wasn't sure. Where I live is the literal definition of living out in the sticks. I don't have any neighbors for probably a good 10 miles anywhere close to me, and I live that far out there. So who or what on earth could it have been getting into my chicken coop? Like I said, I live very far out of any near community, so there's no excuses as to a child walking around late at night. I'm kind of freaked out.